Welcome back to another episode of Compliance Man Takes a Euro
Tim
Trip.
Khasanov-Batirov for another episode of Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip. Today we are thrilled to have as our guest Piotr Żyłka. I know I missed that one, sorry. But in spite of my butchering his name, we're thrilled to have him with us. And if you've ever wondered, Piotr, and here I would ask your guidance, have you ever seen Tim and Compliance Man at the same time? I never have. So I'm beginning to wonder they may be the same people. But we're exploring that mystery throughout this series in our Euro trip. But with all of that, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background and what you do today?
Yeah, hello, hi. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me and for this wonderful introduction, Tom. This pronunciation was outstanding. I know the Polish is not an easy one. Yeah, as Tom said, as Tom has introduced me, I'm Piotr, Compliance and AML officer, author of the It's All About Compliance blog, also publisher of the Risk and Compliance platform Europe. I've got the several years of experience in financial institutions, both operating on the country level in Poland, as well as globally, internationally, as well from the banking, insurance, and payment service sector.
Over to you, Tim.
Piotr, hi, glad to see you this time online.
Yeah.
And knowing your tremendous experience as a compliance and money laundering officer, can you please share best practices in setting internal controls in the company? Maybe there is something very specific from Poland.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and it's nice to see you virtually now. Yeah, I think discussing internal controls in Poland, we do have to look at the banking sector and the recommendation age. This is the recommendation age where within the introduction of this recommendation, which has been issued quite a while ago by the Polish Financial Supervisory Authority, we can find the reference to the Saxon model of the internal controls, or also references to the Basel Committee guidelines on the compliance function within the banking sector. And what's important is that within this particular recommendation serves as a fundamentals, as the base for the compliance as we do perceive it within the Polish market. And what's more important, the compliance function sits within the internal controls, because when we do look within the model of the management of the banking sector, within the provisions of the Polish banking law, we will get to know that according to the Article 9 of this particular legislation, there is an obligation to establish a management system within a particular bank. And within this management system, we've got to distinguish the risk management system and internal control system. And we've got the compliance associated within the internal control system. And why am I referring to this? Because I've got this perspective that, having in mind the development of the compliance within the Polish market, we cannot reach for the experience within the banking sector in terms of compliance, because it's the most experienced and the most mature one. And there we can find also the description of the way how should this internal control system should be established, with its elements, with the control function as well, with the elements. By elements, I mean testing and assurance of the proper management of risk. I would say that would be the point of reference for the Polish market in terms of the internal controls.
Pietro, could I ask, are there any guidelines from the United States? You mentioned the Basel Committee's report, and certainly that is one that has great weight, I think, literally across the world, particularly around internal controls for financial institutions. But do you see any guidelines or regulations that you can utilize at least as a framework from the United States, or does the Basel framework really give you what you need?
I think the COSO guidelines also do apply, as well as I can tell you from my own experience that I do follow what's new on the American market, on the US market. For example, recently I was reviewing the DOJ guidelines for the prosecutors for the evaluation of the compliance programs within companies. And I think that's the good piece of the knowledge how to establish and how to assure that this compliance management system would be working, would be operating in an effective way. As well as far as I'm concerned, New York City Bar Association a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, issued a compliance responsibility paper, on responsibility of the compliance officer. If I'm not recalling that, but it's the case is that this particular paper described the way how do the American market perceive the compliance function and its responsibility. And I think that is also the case here in Poland, that we are still in fact discussing and the way how this compliance should look like, because in fact we do have some definitions within the financial sector, as I have mentioned, within the banking sector, but we are still looking for something that would be the fundamental for the compliance within other sectors rather than those regulated. Because if we are talking about the compliance in Poland right now, we are just focusing on the financial sector market. So, for example, I've mentioned the Basel Committee, but as well we've got some recommendations on the compliance from the European Banking Authority, and in terms of female, the FATCA would be entering in the pole position as well. So that would make you an perception that the way how compliance is being established within the Polish sector is quite coming from abroad.
Tim, let me maybe turn to you. Listeners to all Compliance Man podcasts know that you work extensively in emerging markets and now you're in the EU. Where do you see internal controls in the EU, maybe from the emerging markets perspective as opposed to the US perspective? What are some of the either things that are in common or maybe some key differences you've observed?
Yes. Tom, thank you for this question. And as you already discussed with Piotr, there are different jurisdictions. In some countries, compliance controls are driven by banking industry. Let's, for example, take the Netherlands. We just had the review from the Dutch central bank, or local Federal Reserve, so to say, and they were looking, for example, on compliance with sanctions, and they looked at the banks. We don't have it for the manufacturers or other industries. In the same time, in some countries, and here I also refer, for example, to France, they also set the standards, but it is in one area, in anti-corruption. And having said all that, we, for example, see that there are a lot of violations of trade compliance, export controls. So some countries, like the Netherlands, started to pay attention on that, meaning that the internal controls will be somehow requested or even demanded by the regulators to be incorporated in the companies, not only in banking sectors. In emerging markets, we have a pretty much easier situation. Sometimes, Tom, as you have said, they just copy pasting the US requirements in terms of the effective compliance program. They can modify them a bit, like it was in Ukraine, or they can just take some basic points like they were doing in Kazakhstan. But still, I think it's a good practice to take the US or UK standard if you want to develop a set of standards, not only for the banking or insurance industry, but also for the real sector, for all other companies. That's my personal experience in that.
Piotr, could you give us your thoughts on the general compliance scene in Poland? Is it a new and emerging corporate discipline? Is it a profession that you and others have engaged in? Or how would you assess it at this point?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Also from Timur's perspective, in terms of development of compliance in Poland, as I have mentioned, we have to look into the banking sector, and I would say the initial date that will be around 2005, 2007, one after the Basel Committee guidelines on the compliance function. The predecessor of the Polish Financial Supervisory Authority issued some bill on the on the way how do the supervisory authority sees the compliance. And it's like the initial date, and it has been a long journey for a compliance, not only due to the fact that we've got some regulations for which are coming directly from the financial sector, but also due to the fact that within the Polish market, we've got a lot of American, British, French, German, and Dutch companies. And as Timur mentioned, we've got some within the particular jurisdictions within those countries. There are some compliance-related regulations. For example, like in US, you've got the FCPA. Within the UK, we've got the UK Bribery Act. In France, there is a Sapin-2, etc., etc. And having that in mind, those companies were with the foreign capital, which are present in the Polish market, they do set some standards within the Polish entities which form part of the capital groups from the foreign capital groups. And within those companies, they were established compliance functions which are responsible for aligning, for assuring the compliance with the both Polish law as well as obligations which are arising from the jurisdictions of the, let's call it a mother company, and also the internal regulations, internal standards which depending on the capital group. Those were like two streams of the development of the compliance. In the meantime, we had some governmental propositions on some bills, some acts which might a bit touch a compliance area. For example, the project of the Transparency in Public Life Act, responsibility of collective entities, as well as Whistleblowing Directive, which as for now has not been yet implemented within the Polish legal system. And having that in mind, we do at this moment of the development of the compliance that within the financial sector, there's an obligation and there's the maturity there. We've got some internal corporations, and they are aspiring also to be experts within the compliance. And we've got some regulatory gap within the small and medium entrepreneurship sector, where in fact there is no direct obligation to manage the risk, to manage regulatory risk, or to prevent bribery and corruption, for example. We are struggling with this gap. I would say that there's missing part of this compliance universe in Poland.
I'd like now to address the same question to you both, and I will preface it. It's around sanctions. That is a very hot topic in the United States. The U.S. Department of Justice has made clear that they will aggressively enforce the sanctions laws against U.S. companies that violate sanctions. And we had several $100 million in fines already this year, maybe even over $1 billion. But I wanted to ask that question from each of yours perspective. So Piotr, how would you assess sanctions in Poland, obviously in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And Tim, in the Netherlands, where you practice currently, how would you assess both sanctions compliance and sanction enforcement? And Piotr, as you're the guest, we'll start with you.
All right. Yes, Tom, that's a very good question, because here we have a number of, so to say, hot topics. First of all, if we take the Europe as such, there is always a discussion whether we in Europe have to comply with the US sanctions, or should we just adhere to our local sanctions, which are adopted in each country. And the European Union recently just adopted the 11th package of sanctions. So things are going on in this area, but still there is a legal battle. I'm talking to my friends and peers in the compliant community whether we should take into consideration the US sanctions as well. As there is a history, and sometimes Europe doesn't want to comply with the US sanctions. So that's the one battlefield that we have. The second thing, we have a lack of experts. Nobody expected that the number of sanctions would be so big. Compliance experts didn't have a chance to get more information about Russia, about the way of doing business there, about the way how the companies and oligarchs hide their assets or themselves as beneficiary owners. So I would think that it's a problem. And another topic, it's a hot topic, it's a very traditional story when very often compliance people are lawyers by qualification, and they don't look at compliance with sanctions as a system of internal controls. You should have trainings, you should have engagement of top management, you should have controls as such like KYC, and KYC should be a very of high level, just not to get report about something which was downloaded from Google. So that's something which we've been facing as a problem in certain European countries, but I think that everything will be better. And that's what I see now. I think we're at the very starting point with very effective compliance management in sanctions in the EU.
Can I ask the same question to you about the current sanctions environment in Poland?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for that. And I can only agree with Tim's perspective. In terms of the Polish sanctions regime, as of the commencement of the war in Ukraine, Polish government decided to establish by introducing the new law, they decided to establish also the Polish sanctions list. As for now, we do have to obey both EU sanctions regime, which arises from those particular EU regulations, as well as the Polish sanctions list. And I would say that's something, as Tim said, we are learning by doing, because previously I've had this impression that before February 2022, sanctions regime was like a yeti. Everyone was talking about it, but no one has ever seen it. And it was the case, because there was some information within the media or in the public discussions that there has been issued the new package of sanctions, but in fact no one knew what was the outcome of this particular sanction. And right now, for example, in terms of the Polish sanctions list, we can observe the outcome, I would say positive outcome, because the understanding of the sanctions regime within the society has obviously increased. But by imposing an obligation to verify the ultimate beneficial owner, to verify particular company, and impose this obligation in, I would say, across all the sectors within the Polish economy, that gave a perception of what sanctions regime is in fact, and how shall we apply those provisions, and what is the outcome of entering a particular name or particular company on the sanctions list. And I would say that gave a bit more risk-based approach for companies, that they do have this red flag that we have to make a due diligence for the company, for the contractor we are about to sign an agreement with. I would say before the war, before the sanctions topic began to be so hot, to be on the top of the news, that wasn't a habit, that wasn't a good practice within all sectors.
Piotr, could I change the focus just a little bit and ask you to talk about something that I think we've called the Polish FCPA? Is there such a proposal? Is that in discussions either at the legislative level or between you and your colleagues? How would you assess that idea at this point in time?
Frankly speaking, a few months ago, I wrote an article with that title: "The Polish FCPA is needed ASAP," and that was due to the fact that OECD has been calling Polish government for several years now to implement new law or update the one that currently exists in terms of the foreign corrupt prevention. And as I have mentioned a few minutes ago, there were some initiatives, for example, the Transparency in Public Life Act or the novelization of the Collective Entities Responsibility Act. But as for now, as far as I'm concerned, those are not projects which are about to enter into force. We are waiting at least for the implementation for the Whistleblowing Act, which will implement the EU Whistleblowing Directive into the Polish legal system. But I can tell you that this topic is quite well discussed among the experts from the compliance. I recall a conference in the past winter. A colleague of mine was describing the most essential provisions from the FCPA and how they may apply to the Polish market and the Polish perspective. And I think that's the natural consequence of the development of the market, of the economy, of the maturity of companies. And I would say that the next step I can see, and as far as I'm concerned, that might be the case in the future, that would be the obligation to implement onto the Polish ground the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which imposes an obligation to assure that within your supply of the chain of value, your contractors correctly managing the risk and they are conducting their business in compliance with law, in particular with human rights. I would say that the direction after the implementation of the EU Whistleblowing Directive onto the Polish legal system, Polish grant, I would say that due diligence would be the natural consequence. But I hope that will come back to the topic of the Polish FCPA, because having in mind, for example, the increasing cooperation with stakeholders from across the globe, also some investments from companies from the US, the scrutiny and the compliance would be an asset and would be an added value for the Poland and for Polish companies as a whole, in terms of competing with companies and with other countries in Europe, in terms of obtaining new businesses, new opportunities.
Do you think this would meet the OECD critique?
The OECD within their reports has been criticizing and has been highlighting the importance of the necessity to implement particular legislation for quite some time now, and I think that it does not have a effective influence on the decisive group in Poland.
How about the EU and Brussels? Do you feel their initiatives around anti-corruption might help persuade the Polish legislature?
I think that's the way how we should perceive our role within the EU to fulfill our obligation as a member country, and having in mind, for example, the European Green Deal and also the AML package. I think that the approach with the EU would be heading into direction of the unification among all member countries. So, for example, in terms of AML, we won't be having no more directives, rather regulations, and also the AML supervisory authority, which will cover the whole Europe like an umbrella. And I think that's the direction that each member country would have to apply new scrutiny measures and new laws, due to the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, we are heading into the direct implementation of the EU rather than indirect via directives.
Pietro, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. Tim and I both want to thank you for taking the time to visit with us. It's been very enlightening. We've learned a lot about the Polish compliance scene. I hope we can continue this discussion. For our listeners, if you have comments or even disagree with us, we'd love to hear from you. You can put your comments in the comment section, or if you'd like to come on the podcast and share your views, Tim and I would greatly appreciate it. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. That was a pleasure.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you'll join Tim and I again for another episode of Compliance Man Takes a Eurotrip. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Compliance Man Takes a Eurotrip is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.